Hello, it's Brenda, and this is OTD 550, Week 4. What kinds of evidence are there, and how can you tell if it's any good? So this week we are going to be continuing to select studies that are pertinent to your own research topic, and then learning to critique the studies that you find regarding these different aspects, level of evidence and validity and so forth. But in order to do that, we've got a little bit more to learn about what kinds of studies are out there and how do we know if they're any good or not? How do we critique them? So we have some announcements here. Don't forget plagiarism quizzes due, and we're going to continue that literature search, and that next Monday is our test on September 22nd. So what kinds of evidence are there? We're going to take a look at this. How do we categorize the evidence that we are finding? Well, you're probably going to know categorization by major methodological approach, qualitative, quantitative. But did you know there's some other ways to classify research as well? So let's take a look first of all at the major methodological approaches that you're probably the most familiar with: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. So when we talk about quantitative, of course, we're talking about using a statistical analysis to determine whether or not there's a significant finding. Was there a statistically significant difference between group A and group B, or point A and point B? Is there some kind of number analysis that we can do to tell us that something got better or that something is better than something else? That's what quantitative is all about. Qualitative, instead of using numbers, we're using words. We're analyzing words into themes and categories to explain something that we're observing, or a narrative text, things like this. Typically, they are much smaller in size than a quantitative study because it's very hard to analyze hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands of documents of words. Usually these are not considered to be generalizable, but because they're sort of a different entity altogether, they aren't really judged on their ability to be generalized. But a group of qualitative studies over time, so if we are collecting this information in various ways with various groups over time, it can start to describe a phenomenon that's being experienced in practice. Qualitative studies help to explain the experience of something or generate new themes and new theories of why something is occurring. Mixed methods is, of course, using both quantitative and qualitative means to describe or define a research problem or question. And often this is very pragmatic. We're trying to look at a description of something, and we know that the numbers may not tell the whole story, or that maybe we're suspecting that the numbers are not going to create anything significant, and we want to take a look at what's the qualitative piece of it. What are people saying about it? So then the data are backing each other up. We have triangulation. Is there a sense in which there was a statistically significant change, and what were people saying about that change or that experience? Now, multiple methods design doesn't mean the same thing as mixed methods, so let's talk about what this means a little bit. It is integrating different kinds of multiple methods, but if you're saying multi-method, you might be talking about two or more data collection strategies within the same tradition. So let's say we're doing a quantitative multi-method study. We might be using a survey and a randomized controlled trial or randomized two-group design to get our results. In qualitative, we might be looking at both interviews and observations to put together a multi-method design. So you can use multiple methods within the same tradition. But a classic mixed methods design is looking at both quantitative and qualitative within the same study. An example of this would be if we're collecting both numeric balance measures and qualitative interviews with someone in a fall prevention program, trying to find out if they feel like their fall risk decreased or their ability to be confident in their balance increased. So if you choose a mixed method design, there are multiple types of mixed method designs, and so you need to be sure that you're sharing with your audience which type of mixed methods design that you're using. So one type is a sequential explanatory design. You do your quantitative first, then qualitative. If you do your qualitative first, then quantitative, it's called a sequential exploratory. Sequential transformative is two separate phases, with one type being the core, and you're trying to change something. You're trying to get a sense of how a group or a population improved or changed or made a difference. Concurrent triangulation is the most common. This is where you're using them both at the same time and you're trying to have one kind of data back up the other kind of data. Concurrent nested is where you're sort of placing the emphasis more on one type of tradition, like say quantitative, but you're adding to it with the qualitative to try and triangulate. Or concurrent transformative, where you're using a theoretical perspective to try and change something in a population, and you're going to have a predominant and a secondary tradition that's either nested or triangulated with each other. That's a lot of information in one slide. Just know that with whatever mixed methods that you are trying to choose, you need to be able to share that with your audience. You shouldn't just say mixed methods. You should be saying a mixed method sequential explanatory design or something similar to that. All right, that's our first classification, the major methodological approaches. Now we have research design, and this drills down a little bit more into how we are going to analyze our data. It takes us into a more descriptive definition rather than just saying quantitative or qualitative or mixed. Okay, and this gets into how the researchers analyze their data. And this can make a great deal of difference in how the reader, when they're reading the study, can start to pull out meaning from what it is that they're reading. So what about quantitative? And you've probably heard some of these terms before. So true experimental studies are randomized and they're controlled trials, meaning there is a control group and one or more experimental groups that you're comparing, and that participants are randomized into those two groups. Quasi-experimental is where we have a control and an experimental group, but they're not randomized. Maybe we use the folks at one site as the control group and at another site as the experimental group. Pre-post studies, where the group is their own control, is also quasi-experimental. This can also be conducted longitudinally, where you're looking at several points in time. So you have your pre or your baseline, and then you have several points in time where you're collecting data. You can also use a cross-sectional design. So we're taking one point in time to collect information, and then we're comparing groups against each other. So this might be one point in time where we're looking at a traditional classroom and a sensory integration classroom, and we're taking that cross-sectionally. Or maybe we're using a survey design and we're comparing two different demographic groups, those in the western half of the United States and those in the eastern half of the United States, but at one point in time. Okay? Sequential is a combination of longitudinal and cross-sectional. So maybe we're looking at west and east 5 years apart for 20 years. Okay? Or looking at 3 age groups over a period of years. We're looking at school-age children versus high school children versus preschool kids or something like that on a particular measure. Non-experimental studies are where we're just trying to get a sense of what's going on, sometimes called descriptive studies. We're just maybe doing a survey and finding out what people think about something. So that would be non-experimental. Some also possibly weaker research designs, a single subject design. This can be really important in medicine when we have a very rare case and we want to look at this single subject and see like what might be helping them to improve, or maybe it's something that's very experimental, and so we're doing this single subject design. I think about things like the first heart transplant. There was a single subject design study, right? Okay, so field studies and naturalistic observation, these would be more like things anthropologists do where they're just observing a community, things like that. Survey studies, again, they're cross-sectional if they're completed one time, but longitudinal if they're repeated over time. Now, some people argue that surveys are qualitative, not quantitative. Why would you think that? Okay, I'll let you think about that a little bit. All right, another type of study, kind of a different methodological classification would be psychometric studies. And this may be where we're trying to look at validity, reliability, precision of an assessment tool. These might be on a specific population. So you might be testing a balance test on a specific, like folks with Parkinson's disease. How do they perform on this balance test? This might help us to establish norms. Often norms are established by age groups. The classic would be thinking about grip strength testing. We look at grip strength test by decades, 20 to 29-year-olds, 30 to 39-year-olds, and then we're also looking at male versus female, and they help establish norms. So I got some terms for you, things for you to consider. These are things you've probably heard of before. An independent variable being the thing that we are expecting to produce the effect. It's the thing that we're introducing. So it would be, say, the intervention that we're providing. The dependent variable is the thing that we're hoping that is affected by the independent variable. This is the thing that we're looking for an outcome. So it's often the thing that's measured. So let's say the independent variable is grip exercises, and the dependent variable is, do they increase grip strength? So we would be assessing their grip strength. Confounding variable are extraneous influences. So in this study that we were just talking about, it could be that maybe this person does a particular job that helps them increase their grip strength. They're doing a lot of gripping on their job. That might be a confounding variable in our study. So you know about control and experimental groups. Control is the group that we either do usual care or we don't do anything. There's just no intervention. And the experimental is where we introduce the independent variable. Validity is how well does the thing do what it's supposed to do? How well is it assessing the thing that it's supposed to assess if it's a tool? Reliability is, does it assess the same thing over and over again in the same way? Would you get the same result? And then the idea of specificity, which with the term SPIN, an assessment with high specificity rules in that the person has the thing that you're trying to assess. And SNOUT, an assessment tool with high sensitivity, means that if a person tests negatively, you can rule out that particular thing that's being tested. All right, a couple more terms, blind and double blind. So if something is blind, that means that the reviewer or the researcher does not know who's in which trial. That's where the participant would know or not know which trial they're in. Double blind is where neither the participant nor the researcher know which group the person is in. Are they getting the COVID vaccine or are they getting a placebo? Okay. Types of validity. So construct validity. Does the assessment tool measure what the concept that it's supposed to measure? So if we say that we are measuring grip strength, is the tool actually measuring their grip strength or is it measuring something else like endurance? Okay. Concurrent validity. Does the test relate to a test that we know works well? So maybe if we have one instrument for grip strength, say a JMAR dynamometer, maybe we're trying to test a new kind of instrument to see if it also is accurate. We might test it against the JMAR dynamometer. Okay. Predictive validity. Is the instrument accurate in predicting something in the future? Okay, some sort of outcome. Can it predict some sort of outcome? So can grip strength predict how well someone's going to be able to carry out their ADLs, particularly maybe cooking, opening jars, things like that? What about types of reliability? Well, here's a couple of them. Inter-rater reliability. Does the test produce the same results with different raters, different people doing the testing? Test-retest reliability. If I retest the person again, do I get the same result as when I tested them the first time on multiple occasions? So let's say a typical person who is doing typical work, doesn't have any injuries, and we test them on their grip strength today, tomorrow, next week. Are we going to get relatively the same results? What's the reliability? Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about some qualitative research designs. So there are basically 5 main traditions. The first is phenomenological. That's just kind of fun to say. Phenomenological. You can impress all your friends with that. Phenomenological studies simply look at describing a phenomenon. They look at texts, they look at interviews, they look at, what is this phenomenon that we're trying to look at. They're considered to be heuristic, which means rooted in everyday reality. What does everyday reality look like for this person? So an example would be a study of people who've had a stroke to find out what their experience is like having had a stroke, what things are going on in their daily life. And the themes just emerge from the text that we're getting. Grounded theory is very different, and oftentimes this is what you think of when you think of a classic qualitative study. Grounded theory is when you are trying to create a new theory about why something is happening. Okay? So oftentimes we are collecting data, creating some sort of a scheme or some emergent themes as a result of that. And then we're going to go back to our participants and continue to collect data until we have what we call saturation. We're not getting any new themes to come out of it. And then we take that information and we'll put together some sort of, usually a visual schematic that explains a particular phenomenon. Okay? Narrative inquiry is where we're asking people to tell us stories, and we are then analyzing the stories according to a very narrative approach. It has a very specific methodological process with it. Ethnography is where you are actually living and working among the people who you are studying. And there are very few OT studies that do this. One that I know of in particular was studying a work group's response to, working in a certain clinical setting. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. But the person who was doing the study was actually part of that work group as well. So they're taking notes on their own observations. Sociologists will often do ethnographic studies and go live among the people that they're studying. Anthropologists as well. And case studies, again, where you're looking at a particular case, you're taking data on that case or maybe a series of similar cases, and then you're compiling some information on what worked with them or just describing the situation for them. Okay? Qualitative studies have a smaller sample size, an emphasis on the words or the descriptions, not the numbers, and some of the methodologies include interviews, observations, focus groups, questionnaires, other methods designed to look at someone's experience of something. Okay, not necessarily looking at change. All right, so now we've looked at a lot of things, right? We've looked at our major methodological approaches. We've looked at our research methodologies as kind of drilling down a little further. And now we're looking at basic research, applied research, and transformative research as three different classifications of sort of the functions of research. So here's our third classification. So basic research is basic science, laboratory-based usually. It's kind of what you think of as a true research study with test tubes and things like that. And you're looking at understanding a phenomenon or testing a theory. I have a theory that this intervention is going to help people with strokes get better. Okay? Occupational science often falls here because it exists to generate explanations of human behavior in everyday life circumstances, behaving within occupational contexts. So it's a description, okay? Sometimes a description of how things get better for people. But usually it's under like what we would call laboratory conditions. It's set up to be very specific. Now it could be clinical conditions, but it's definitely looking at how does this help them get better. Applied research is information generated specifically to inform practice. Usually intervention studies go here, all right? We're trying to apply this in a more realistic setting for people, all right? Not in a lab, not in a situation that is very well controlled. It's more, are we seeing in a natural setting if people are getting better with the interventions that we're providing. This can also be creation and testing of assessment tools. So are they working in real life for us? Transformative research then is designed to bring about change, and this is often considered to be participatory research, where the participants actually get involved in the research process themselves as taking over the research process, and they become the change agents. So an example of this might be if we're doing a fall prevention study and we have these people who are at risk for falls lead their own peers in a fall prevention type of situation, a fall prevention class or study. Okay, they are more rare. They do occur in occupational therapy, but they're just a little bit more rare. All right, so how can you tell if the evidence is any good? So in order to understand if the evidence is any good, we need to understand a little bit more about the types of sources, the types of studies that we're looking at, sort of the level or the quality of the evidence that we're looking at. And this is where our levels of evidence will come into play. This is where we will begin to use the Johns Hopkins nursing evidence-based practice scale. We're not going to use those today. We're going to be looking at things in more general terms today. We'll return to that and look at Johns Hopkins here in a few more weeks. So one of the things that we're looking at in published research are, first of all, which ones are primary sources, which ones are secondary sources, and which ones are more like reports, okay? So some of our primary sources, like empirical research reports, are peer-reviewed journal articles, and these are both qualitative and quantitative, all right, considered to be experimental reports. We can also look at like systematic reviews and scoping reviews of the literature that pulls together some of this information for us and says, here's what's out there in the literature. There are also such things as project proposals, often published online, and these are telling you what people are going to do. They're considered to be their outline of how they're going to be conducting a study. Those can also be published reports as well. Not as strong as a completed study in giving you the information. Another type of synthesis is a meta-analysis, and these are considered to be like top of the best, very, very best, because these take experimental studies and actually conduct a second statistical analysis. So they have to be studies that are all using the same measures, say that dynamometer for grip strength testing, and then it combines results from all those studies, gets the original data, combines it, and it strengthens the results by showing us if we meta-analyze all these different studies that people did, can we come up with a statistically significant result, and what does that look like? So that's why they're considered like top of the pyramid, and they don't occur very often. Less rigorous sources would be case reports, and then you get down into levels 4 and 5 on the Johns Hopkins scale that are simply opinion papers and theoretical essays, kind of ideas about what might work or ideas of putting together things that we've observed in practice as a theory of why and how occupations occur. Okay. There are also professional publications that are non-peer-reviewed, like OT Practice and OT Now, the Special Interest Section Quarterly Practice, and then some of the things that are published on AOTA's website, like CAP papers, or on the Cochrane Review webpage. These are collections of information that are provided to us to let us know about studies that have occurred, but they're less rigorous, and sometimes they are secondary sources. Oftentimes in OT Practice or OT Now, you get interesting papers that can provide you good information on getting ideas to use in practice. But it's often I tried it, and you can too, sort of programmatic. We tried this new program. It's more related to program creation, program evaluation, things like that. Secondary sources are where someone has taken the information and they've sort of put it together in possibly a new way. So books and book chapters, like our textbook. Our textbook is a secondary source of information about how to do research, all right, taking its information from a lot of primary sources. Government reports, a different type of report. It's an organizational report, or other organizations like the World Health Organization, the Center for Disease Control, the Center for Medicaid Services, and so forth. They put out their own reports of their own data. They're often descriptive in nature. They're just giving you the numbers. They're not pulling them together or comparing them against each other or running t-tests. They're just describing, the census or the prevalence of a particular kind of disease. So like when we would get reports on COVID, how many people had COVID this week? Those are organizational reports and they're descriptive information, but they're not as strong as the research reports. Things like laws, acts of Congress, Supreme Court decisions are also considered secondary sources. And then you also have your gray literature, unpublished reports, which can include, of course, things like dissertations, things like self-published reports that people have. Okay, something else that we need to know when we're considering if research is any good is, did the study follow the typical guidelines for reporting research? And boring as it is, you'll see that same format, right? In every single research paper that you read: title, abstract, introduction, method, results, discussion, conclusion. And those different sections, we can expect what's going to be found in them. And where can you find that information? So actually, your APA manual is a great source of information. There's a section called JARS, Journal Article Reporting Standards, that lists out for qualitative and quantitative studies what they should have in them. Which, pro tip, if you are working on writing up your research report and you want to know, well, does this thing about the participants go in the method or does it go in the results? Check your APA manual under the JARS standards and it'll show you where that it should go. Okay, so here's our quantitative pyramid of evidence. I just pulled this off, an online source. I was looking for something that was rather general as to which types are stronger evidence than others. There's another one in your book that is actually very, very similar, and this is also similar to the Johns Hopkins method that we're going to be using. Top of the pyramid is our meta-analyses and systematic reviews, and then moving down to our randomized controlled trials. After that, we start looking at quasi-experimental studies, which are our cohort studies and our case-controlled studies, where the case, a person, an individual, serves as their own control for how, they do later on. So it's case-controlled. Lower than that would be our case reports, and then even below that is background information or expert opinion. Okay, 3 other factors that we need to consider when we're looking at quantitative levels of evidence. Strength, how high on the pyramid is it? What kind of quality was put into the methodology of the study? Was it blinded, double-blinded? Was it randomized? Things like that. And did they use the right statistical test for the thing that they were assessing? And we're going to be learning more about this even in next semester. Okay, size of the effect. So effect size is an important aspect that we have to look at with evidence. And when it comes to quantitative studies, researchers should be reporting the effect size, because this is not only was it statistically significant, but how important was that difference? Because you can have a statistically significant difference between, say, 1 pound and 4 pounds of grip, but is there enough of a difference between 1 and 4 pounds to say, oh, this is an intervention that we should actually use? It's an important difference when it comes to people performing their ADLs. And then relevance. How important is this information for using in practice? And this is why we always add implications in our discussion section. Quality of evidence in qualitative research. Now, I'm not going to go into each of these right now because we will be spending more time on it later when we get into next semester, and we're looking at how do we show that our qualitative study is strong. But it includes things like descriptive vividness. Were we thorough in our descriptions? Methodological congruence, analytical preciseness, and theoretical connectedness. Were we precise in our methodology for analyzing the data that we collected, all those words that we collected with our qualitative study? Did we connect it back to the theories that we were using to guide our study? And then heuristic relevance just means, does it relate to real life? Is it helpful in real life? All right, so in conclusion, what kinds of research are there? There's a lot. And sometimes the same kind of research has more than one name. You call it by different names. So you want to use precise language to describe your study. That's really important. And how can you tell it's any good? Depends on the type of study that you have. And it's important to be able to critique whether the evidence that we have gained from searching the literature is worth paying attention to or not. Thanks a lot, and I will see you soon.